Welcome to this initial episode of Raising Men. My name is Sean Dawson. I'm starting this podcast because, well, the world my boy will inherit is nothing like the one that I grew up in. I'm not an expert with all the answers. I'm a dad who's just trying to recognize his humility and ask better questions. If you're listening to this, maybe you've been asking some of the same ones. I'll tell you what keeps me up at night. We're raising boys in a culture that's simultaneously telling them that they're too much. They're not enough. They're too aggressive and not assertive enough. They're too emotional, but also too stoic. They're growing up with unlimited access to everything except clarity about what it actually means to be a good man. And while we, their parents, are debating masculinity in conference rooms and comment sections, our sons are learning from YouTube algorithms and social media influencers. They're getting their blueprint for manhood from people who've never changed a diaper or stayed up all night with a sick kid or took him to the hospital. Frankly, they're getting their blueprint from people you'd shield them from if you ran into them on a train. Let me tell you a story. Now, my wife and I, we agonized over the decision about whether or not to have kids. So I did what I presume all engineers do. I conducted an analysis and a field study of the matter. Now, at the time, I was traveling a lot. So I sat next to a lot of strangers on airplanes. And I interviewed just about everybody I knew and everybody I met on those planes about how they felt about their decision, whether or not to have kids. The main thing that I learned is that there was no wrong answer. Pretty much everyone I talked to was pretty happy about whatever decision they made. But the thing that I noticed was that the parents were happy in this fundamental, almost spiritual way. Whereas the non-parents, well, they were mostly just bragging about how much money they still had. The best response that I got came from a person I very much admire. We were sitting on his porch, and his gorgeous wife and their 3-year-old son were playing frisbee with their border collie in the yard. He said, I love my wife. She's great. But that boy is my soulmate. Man, my experience in the early days could not have been more opposite to this. One of the suspicions I had, in fact, is that all of that positivity that I experienced during my research was just a ruse to make non-parents just as miserable as the parents were. My wife and my lives were obliterated. It was so grueling and awful that my wife and I, we were at each other's throats constantly, and we had to make an explicit agreement that we wouldn't get divorced before the boy was at least a year old. For example, his stomach was both very elastic, but also way smaller than his appetite. So he would projectile vomit 3 or 4 times his body length, like a bottle of Diet Coke with a Mentos dropped into it. Between that and the dirty diapers that we left all over the place, the dogs were in paradise, believe me. Now, the first time I had a twinge of what my friend was talking about with the soulmate thing, the boy was about 4 months old, and I just finished changing his diaper. I held out my index fingers, and he reached up and he pulled himself up by them. It was the very first time that I taught him anything at all. And it clicked for me that my job, my role, is to foster an environment where he can build the skills that he needs to make his place in the world. And for the very first time, I felt it. I understood a little bit about what my friend meant by soulmate. It reminded me of a time years earlier when I was 12 years old. I went on a work trip with my dad one summer. Now, this was towards the end of the trip. We were in Arlington, Texas. And I was stuck for 2 days in a hotel room, literally looking down at the Six Flags amusement park that was across the highway from our hotel. But I was unable to go. It was kind of torture, frankly. But the Texas State Fair was going on. And on the very last day of the trip, my dad took me to the fair. Now, the centerpiece of the Texas State Fair is this enormous Ferris wheel. My dad and I rode it together near the top, looking out over the lights of the city. My dad puts his arm around me and he says, "I think you're going to be a great man someday." And I was too wrapped up in my own stuff at the time. I'm 12 going on 13. But what I realize now is that this was his way of saying to me, however imperfectly, "Son, you're my soulmate." My wife and I, we have some friends who lost their 2.5-year-old boy in this freak accident. They were hiking in the woods and a tree just fell down and hit the boy. He was gone. Just like that. His dad standing right next to him. And I think about that dad every day. That is the manifestation of all of my life's fears and worries all at once. I wouldn't know how to live through it. And it drove home to me that you can lose them at any time. So what do you do? Well, one of the things I did was to take my boy camping. I'd mentioned it as a possibility one time, and he kind of pestered me about it. He asked me about it several times. And so I set it up. And one of the pleasures that I find about being a parent, it's like when you meet a friend who's never seen a movie that you particularly like. Like, oh my gosh, you've never seen The Usual Suspects. We have to go see it right now. And then you get to experience it anew through their eyes. That's the way your kid is about everything. And camping was definitely like that. This is my first time in a sleeping bag, and this is my first time being inside of a tent. We built a fire. We made hot dogs, s'mores. About 1:30 in the morning, we were sleeping in the tent. It was very cold, very dark. And we could hear the coyotes roaming around and howling. And he stirred. He said, "Dad, can you keep me warm?" I unzipped my sleeping bag a little bit. I pulled him close. I said, "Of course, buddy. I'll always keep you warm." But what I was really trying to say was, "Son, you're my soulmate." Now, he doesn't understand that any more than I did on the Ferris wheel back then. But hopefully I'll get better over time. And decades from now, he'll be able to say it to his son a little bit better than I said it to him. Now, this isn't a podcast about returning to some mythical good old days. Frankly, those days weren't that good for a lot of people. This is about moving forward with intention. Because here's what I've learned. Our sons, they don't need us to be perfect. They need us to be present. They don't need us to have all the answers. They need us to be willing to wrestle with difficult questions. Questions like, how do we teach them to be strong? without being brittle? How do we navigate a culture that either worships the worst parts of masculinity or tries to vilify it out of existence entirely? How do we show them that real strength stems from recognizing and admitting when you're wrong? How do we prepare them for a world where emotional intelligence is mandatory? How do we raise men who can lead with both conviction and compassion? Maybe the hardest question of all is, what kind of man should I model for my son? Now, look, I don't want to be dramatic, but the statistics about this stuff are really sobering. Young men, they're struggling with purpose, with connection, and mental health at unprecedented rates. They're more isolated. They're less likely to have close friendships. And they're increasingly disconnected from the kind of mentorship that used to happen naturally. But here's what gives me hope. Intentional parents who are willing to do the work, not just on their sons, but on themselves too. Because our boys, they're not really even just listening to what we say. They're watching what we do and they're becoming who we are. Raising Men will be honest conversations about raising sons with purpose. Some episodes might just be me wrestling with questions that keep me up at night. Others will be conversations with parents, experts, and folks who've walked this road before us, who've succeeded and failed. We'll talk about discipline that builds character, not compliance, about teaching boys to navigate emotions without drowning in them, about raising men who can disagree without demonizing, who can be confident without being arrogant, who can be tender without being weak. Now, it's not always going to be comfortable, but it will always be authentic and it will always be real. So if you're still listening, I want to invite you to something bigger than a podcast. I want to invite you into this notion of intentional parenthood. Because, frankly, the world needs more men of character. And character does not happen by accident. It's forged in the daily decisions of parents who refuse to let their sons be raised by default by a potentially toxic culture. So, here's what happens next. Subscribe to the show. And really importantly, if you can, share it with another dad who might be asking the same questions. And connect with me on social at Raising Men Podcast, because this conversation doesn't end when the episode does. Most importantly, take a look at your son today. Really look at him. Ask yourself, what kind of man is he going to become because of who I choose to be? That's where it starts. Thanks so much for being here. So let's go raise some men together.